morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. First of all, thank you all for your ongoing support. As a small nonprofit, we depend on your viewership, donations, and membership. We're committed to bringing you a rich lineup of programs on the most compelling and timely issues. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program. Today, in recognition of Earth Day, we are pleased to present our live stream on California's future power grid, smart, resilient, and reliable. We want to thank our sponsors, Edison International and the World Affairs Councils of America, for their financial support. It's now my pleasure to welcome today's panelists. Drew Murphy, Senior Vice President, Strategy and Corporate Development at Edison International. Dr. Stephen Lowe, Professor in Computing and Mathematical Sciences at Resnick Sustainability Institute at Caltech. Nancy Rader, Executive Director at California Wind Energy Association. And Danielle Osborne Mills, California Director for the American Clean Power Association. Our moderator is Rosa Bravo. Rosa is a senior technology executive and a member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall Board of Directors. Rosa, we're so happy that you were able to moderate today's program. Let me bring you on and let you introduce this wonderful group of panelists.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning to everyone. I'm Rosa Bravo, and I'm delighted to be with you today for the continuation of our sustainability series as we focus on California and the future of our power grid. For many, the topics of sustainability, energy, and the grid have long been considered esoteric. However, the personal impact that we are now all experiencing from climate change, resulting in wildfires, blackouts, high electricity demands, have made it a matter of importance that we all as citizens need to better understand the problem and our roles in contributing to the solutions. So today we are joined by 4 key leaders who represent organizations deeply committed to leading the way toward a renewable energy and sustainable future for our state. I'll introduce each of our guest panelists again with a question to set the stage for our discussion. Our first guest, Drew Murphy, who is the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Corporate Development of Edison International. Edison's vision is to lead the transformation of the electric power industry toward a clean energy future. Its subsidiaries include Edison Energy and Southern California Edison, one of the largest utilities in the US, serving more than 15 million people. Drew, thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be here.
If you would, for our broader audience, first ground us and explain how climate change and extreme weather conditions are putting our power grid here in California at risk. And then if you would comment on how that is driving innovation at Edison in terms of the modernization of the grid and a shift to clean energy.
Great. Well, thanks, Rosa. I'm really happy to be here with this great panel and so many people listening in. I think for those of us in California, I think we all have a pretty good sense of how climate change is affecting us right now. We're seeing the very imminent and real effects of it, and we're also know that even with the mitigations that the state has planned and some of the actions we're all trying to take to reduce greenhouse gases and all that is likely to continue into the future. I mean, that the primary impacts, and we've seen them in recent years, are increase in excessive heat and especially in the summer, but now going into other parts of the year. More and more cycles of drought. We're in another, looks like another cycle of drought here in the state now. We're in the second year of what looks like a drought, and we're going to see that impact us this summer. Starting even now, we're starting to see wildfire season. So wildfire is another impact of climate change. We're seeing wildfires your season become wildfire all year round. And in fact, we just announced last week the first of our public safety power shutoff programs actually having to be put in place in April. This is unprecedented to hear that in April because of how dry things are. So heat, drought, increased severity of weather patterns, including really strong winds that leads to certainly exacerbates things. And you're talking about fires, but other things as well. And then, increased storms. When we do have rain and we have storms, they actually are more powerful and do more damage. So those are some of the immediate impacts. Longer term, we'll also see impacts from sea level rise, which we haven't really started to see fully yet, but we expect that will be there as well. So those are some of the things that we are looking at. Most important, obviously, for us from the grid standpoint, since we operate the electric grid in a large part of the state, is really the first couple of those that I mentioned, which is this combination of heat, drought, wind, and storms that lead to potentially even greater wildfire and impact on our system. So what is that driving us to do? About 3 years ago, so 2019, we actually put out a paper called Pathway 2045, which tried to look at what we need to do as a state to meet the goals of the Paris Accord and the goals that the state has to get to essentially carbon-free and net zero by 2045 and carbon-free power by 2045. That frames for us as a company and as an organization what we think both we need to do to mitigate as much as possible the impacts of climate change, as well as what needs to happen across the broader economy. So that drives sort of a lot of the innovation that you're asking about in terms of, where do we have to put our time and effort? Where does our strategy focus on? And I wanted to just sort of highlight a couple of really key components of that, which is obviously continuing to deploy more and more clean energy that can be, and transmit that and deliver that to our customers across the grid. So renewables being the main thing is moving more and more towards a higher renewables. And we have this goal of 100% of the retail sales of our electricity being carbon-free electricity by 2045. And there's a pathway to get there. How do you do that? Well, you've actually got to clean the energy sector up, but you've got to clean the rest of the economy up. And you've got to use that clean grid also to power more and more parts of the economy. So we all know transportation is going to have to be much more electric than it is now. By 2045, maybe 75% of light duty vehicles on the road, that's 26 million vehicles, will have to be electric. A lot of the heavy duty, about 2/3 of the medium and heavy duty will have to be electric as well. We also are going to have to electrify the building space. So homes, buildings, offices, factories, more and more will have to be electrified, especially space heating and water heating. That's driving a lot of need for innovation and change as well. There's still going to be a set of things that can't be electrified, and we'll have to work on no and low carbon fuels. And then ultimately, how do we capture, sequester, or offset the carbon that remains in the economy? All of that leads to, for us, about $170 billion of clean energy investment between now and 2045, we think, in that sector. Increasing electricity usage, decreasing fossil fuel usage, gasoline, natural gas, that kind of thing. So that's sort of how we see it all evolving over time. And I would say specifically right now, what that's leading us to do is to focus on what does the grid need to look like? That's the thing for us. How do we make it? It's going to have to be a different grid. It has to be hardened right away. It has to be more resilient so that we can withstand these wildfire threats that are happening now. We also have to move to a much more technologically driven, optimized grid that uses a lot more technology, has a lot more flexibility, and uses both technologies that are in people's homes and buildings behind the meter, we call it, as well as big grid connected technologies like renewables, sort of on the front side of the meter. We put out a paper this past year that's a follow on to the other one I mentioned called Reimagining the Grid. And that really talks about how we need to use technology to create a much more flexible, integrated grid that's going to, sort of adapt to all of these challenges. So that's just really an overview of maybe how we think about climate change, and it's driving all of that activity both in our business and in the economy more broadly.
Thank you so much. I know we're going to be going down some of these finer points to some of the points that you brought up, and I know that this is part of what Dr. Lowe has been working on as well. So why don't I go ahead and introduce Dr. Lowe, who is joining us today. He's the F.J. Galoon Professor of Engineering and Applied Science at the Resnick Sustainability Institute at Caltech. The Resnick Sustainability Institute advances global sustainability through transformational science, engineering, and education, and prioritizes research that addresses challenges and opportunities associated with climate change and the stewardship of natural resources. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for being with us. I know it's really early where you're at in Melbourne, so thank you. Please tell us a little bit of, there you go. Please tell us a little bit about the research areas you're focused on. And if you would, share a few highlights of your research and what you see as the key characteristics of the future power grid.
Great to be here. Thank you, Rosa. So California, as Drew said, has committed itself to have 100% clean and renewable electricity in just 25 years. So this is going to transform our grid architecturally, encompassing generations, distribution, but also consumption. So the research in my lab has been focusing on some of the challenges that must be overcome in order to achieve this goal. For example, to achieve 100% clean and renewable electricity, we need to replace the gas generators by, say, wind and solar generation. And that is going to create two challenges at least. One is that we're going to have a lot more uncertainty in supply, but also in net demand. And that increases both the frequency and severity of grid instability. Second is that we will lose the traditional means to deal with such volatility at a time when we need it most, because grid stability has been maintained traditionally by controlling large fossil fuel generators, which really determines the dynamics and stability of the entire network. So we can get into a bit more detail later on, perhaps, on why that is the case. And therefore, the grid is going to look very different from the traditional grid in the last 100 years. And therefore, we need a different way to think about grid stability. And I think in any solution, there are going to be at least three important components. One is that there's a really great inherent flexibility in a lot of the loads that we do not exploit today, but we must in the future if we have lose our control and also even predictability of the supply side. Because the key for stability is really to balance supply and demand at all times, at all points of the network. So in the past, what we do is that we control the supply, but we don't really control very actively all the loads. So in the future, that needs to be flipped. The second thing is we need some form, probably multiple forms of energy storage at scale. And I think electric vehicle will be an integral part of that solution. And the third is perhaps even more important and perhaps more difficult, is that we need a business models and also policy environment to really incentivize the development and deployment of flexible loads of electric vehicles and storage devices and so on. So my research has been focusing on the first two, mainly the control and optimization of a large network of active distributed energy resources, and also the electric vehicle charging at scale.
Thank you, Stephen. I look forward to getting into that a little bit more as well here. Let me introduce now Nancy Rader, who is the Executive Director of the California Wind Energy Association. CalWIA is a nonprofit trade organization that advocates on behalf of its wind energy industry members in California's policy forums, seeking to encourage and support the production of electricity through the use of wind generators. Nancy, thank you for being with us today. So in our discussion, I learned that wind energy is the country's fourth largest source of electric capacity behind natural gas, coal, and nuclear energy. And while it creates no emissions and uses virtually no water, at this time, most of the wind turbines in California are located in 6 regions. What can we expect will be happening in this state to further advance wind energy? And what are the challenges to maximizing this particular resource?
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me today. A big part of the reason that California achieved its goal last year to generate a third of its electricity from renewables is that the state made a decision more than a decade ago to build major transmission lines to connect some of the state's best renewable energy resources with its population centers in Southern California. And that was necessary because our transmission system was built largely around fossil fuel plants in urban areas but the cheapest and most abundant renewable energy is found in more rural areas. So Edison, Southern California Edison, planned and built transmission lines connecting LA to the wind resource area in Kern County, which has more wind and solar projects now than any other county. And just that one county provides almost a quarter of the state's renewable energy production. And new transmission was also built in the San Diego Imperial County region at about that time. And so those two counties are also big contributors to our success so far. But since then, no major transmission additions have been planned for renewables. And that's really a problem because that process takes 10 years. So we're now way behind the curve for where we need to be to meet our 2030 clean energy targets. And another important reason that we've met our goals so far is that Kern County has welcomed renewable energy development, but it's been a really different story in many other counties. In fact, in LA County, there's also terrific wind resources just south of Kern County, but LA County has prohibited wind energy development there, so LA has no wind projects at all. And likewise, the federal government prohibited wind energy development in most areas of the desert to the east of LA, where the federal government owns most of the land. So in part because of these types of land use restrictions, we really now need to put wind turbines offshore. But I can't say, unfortunately, that the state has made much progress on that front either. So in short, the two big challenges we're facing are identifying sufficient land and sea space for renewable energy development, and then planning and building the transmission lines we'll need to connect those areas to load centers. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. Danielle, this is a perfect time to introduce you. So rounding out our panel is Danielle Osborne-Mills, the California Director for American Clean Power, which is the voice of public and private companies from across the clean power sector, which includes wind, solar, transmission, and storage companies that provide cost-effective solutions to the climate crisis while creating jobs. So Danielle, your organization, American Clean Power, is keeping a very watchful eye on our progress with a tracking tool that not only ranks the nation as well, but each state by various clean energy related metrics. As our audience may or may not know, California was an early leader in renewable energy, with SB 100 putting us on the road to 100% renewable energy and climate goals by 2045. How are we doing? Are we on track? Do we have the right policies in place?
Thanks, Rosa. It's a pleasure to be here today. The short answer is that California is not on track to achieve 100% clean energy by 2045. And we'll really need to pick up the pace if we're to align with Biden's infrastructure plan, which sets a goal of 100% clean energy by 2035. With regard to the tracking tool, California currently ranks 11th nationwide in deployment of wind, solar, and storage technologies. And while we were an early leader and there are some successes to celebrate, we really have to scale up. And as some of the previous panelists have indicated, there is a major transformation that is about to occur. And this isn't just in California. We as a society, and this is reflected at every level of government as well, are realizing that goals and long-term targets are important, but that particularly in the face of climate change, those goals and targets must be met with immediate and sustained action. And this is where California has fallen behind. So over the last decade, the state has built an average of 1 gigawatt of utility scale solar and 300 megawatts of wind per year. But recent statewide modeling indicates that the state will need to build up to 6 gigawatts of new renewable energy and storage resources annually. So that's roughly 6 times what we've been on pace to do. By 2030, we'll need to deploy 48 gigawatts of renewables and storage, putting us on track to achieve 145 gigawatts of new renewables and storage by 2045. These are enormous numbers. They're hard to wrap your head around, but it's time for the state to stop resting on its laurels and start acting. American Clean Power has a plan for how to ensure that California can decarbonize the economy without compromising affordability or reliability. It's great to see that Southern California Edison has been doing some thinking around this too, and others. We've been paying attention to that. We've also been watching the city of Los Angeles and their recent announcement around clean energy and plans to decarbonize LADWP's electricity sector. But we've yet to see the state put action behind the promises of 100% clean energy. So from our perspective, the state needs to focus on 3 key areas: deployment, procurement, and planning. For deployment, this involves working with transmission owners, agencies, and renewable project developers to actually interconnect renewable resources and upgrade the transmission and infrastructure system in a timely manner so that these resources can deliver affordable and reliable power to all of you. This also includes addressing some of our permitting challenges that Nancy alluded to, which currently compromise our ability to construct and operate projects in a timely and environmentally responsible manner. On procurement, unfortunately, we learned the severity of the state's insufficient power supply in the face of more extreme climate events in August. The August of 2020 outages highlighted a failure for the state to bring new capacity online to enable planned retirements of coastal gas plants and nuclear plants. And now the California Public Utilities Commission has an opportunity to correct its earlier shortcomings by requiring procurement of roughly 10 gigawatts of new renewables and storage to come online by mid-decade. This is going to be critical to getting the grid reliability and economy-wide decarbonization that we need. We really need to make sure that we have sufficient power supply to be electrifying other sectors of our economy and powering the economy into the future. Also, this procurement needs to reflect the need for resource diversity and making sure that our renewable portfolio is complementary. So we have wind resources that blow in the evening hours as the sun is setting, and we're losing our daily solar supply, and we need to be storing that power as well with various types of batteries and storage technologies. So as we transition to the grid that is majority renewables, we need to think about how variable resources like wind and solar can complement and provide flexibility to the grid as well. And then the third category is planning. We need to make sure that we start acting on all of this today, but some of these resources, as Nancy mentioned, we know we'll need, like offshore wind or long duration storage or new transmission lines. Those will take 10 or more years to build. So we need to act now, but we also need to plan and make sure that our planning is in alignment with our near-term actions and well integrated. That'll help us move forward with a more concerted effort. And I'll just close this opening question by saying that a common thread that we've seen between the LA study and the California Joint Agency SB 100 report and countless others is that we have no time to waste. The Biden decarbonization plan recognizes that reality. I've yet to see any other decarbonization study suggest that we should slow down or hit pause or think this through. We've seen the costs of inaction and they're just too great. Looking forward to more discussion.
Thank you, Danielle. As you can see, we have quite a bit to discuss here, and probably could use a couple more hours for this conversation. But why don't we go ahead and jump into the discussion itself? And Drew, in an earlier question, you addressed how climate change, which is resulting in the wildfires and blackouts, is putting that power grid at risk. Could you further elaborate on the issue? Some of the barriers, the anticipated timeline to fixing this complex problem, and how the grid stability is being ensured?
Yeah, well, I'll try to give you our perspective as much as I can. I mean, I would emphasize that obviously trying to address just the wildfire risk aspect of what we're seeing climate change do involves multiple stakeholders across, the sort of the state, which I think is important to remember. But in terms of from our perspective, one of the things we've really been focusing on is trying to build both hardening of the grid, because our objective is to do two things with the grid, which is one is to make sure that to the extent there are these more extreme events, wildfires and higher heat and all, that the grid is hardened and more robust, more resilient itself to withstand the impact of those. So that there is a fire, it's not as impacted, or it can recover more quickly. The same thing in these high heat events, that they can continue to perform well. We obviously also want to harden it so that when we have these extreme weather events, which high winds and very, very dry fuel conditions on the ground, if something happens and our grid then doesn't actually ignite a fire that can turn out to be a major fire. So we have those dual objectives. We've got a pretty aggressive and tight time frame for this grid hardening effort, and deploying a lot of technology around it that will help give us better situational awareness and the better ability to use tools like when we have to power shutoffs or circuits, de-energizing specific circuits, or responding to specific situations more quickly, Our time frame, we just updated this year our wildfire mitigation plans, which we're working with, the commission that regulates us on. We've got 2 to 3 years to get a huge amount of work done in terms of hardening the grid, deploying insulated conductor, more weather monitoring, more wind monitoring, more sectionalization in the high fire risk areas that we serve, where our wires run through high fire risk areas. So for our part, we're focused on significant risk reduction over the next several years. And we've been at this for the last 3 years in a really expanded way. I mean, we've been doing this kind of work for a long time, but it's really been the last 3 or 4 years we've been focused on it. So that's a lot of what we're doing. I would say that we're also really trying to work with other stakeholders to make sure that the state has the resources it needs to respond to these conditions and respond to fires. I think we saw the benefits of that last year in what was a really extreme weather year, and yet luckily we were generally able to avoid some of the major catastrophes happening. We still had bad fires, but the state was obviously better positioned to respond with more resources in the right places, and we need to work on that. We need to work on making sure that cities, counties, governments are managing the urban interface with these wildfire areas much better, and making sure that they're reducing the risk there. That forestry management is actually being done better. One of the interesting things we learned we actually have some forest land up near one of our hydro plants in the Sierra, that's near Shaver Lake, where we manage the forest there ourselves, and we've been doing it for a number of years. And because we actively manage it and make sure that we're removing dead and dried trees and things, that forest was much more robust when we had the fires up there, the creek fire this year, than the nearby forests that weren't managed that way. So we've got to all be pulling together to sort of use all of those tools. And when it comes to wildfire, that to us, that is, that has to happen now and is happening now. We're putting a lot of focus on it. So that's something that that's a little bit of a sense of how we're working on this. And we're working together with the other utilities on these same plans at the moment.
And in terms of aging infrastructure, how is that coming along? And is there a timeline for how that's going to be moving forward?
Well, so in conjunction with this wildfire sort of hardening and mitigation work I mentioned, we always have we've had a plan now for the last 7 or 8 years to do grid modernization. We're now looking at that through this Pathway 2045 lens. So we are constantly upgrading, the grid, both from a hardening standpoint, but from a standpoint of making it more modern and trying to put more technology out there. That's an ongoing effort that we're involved in all the time. And so we don't stop in terms of replacing older infrastructure. We prioritize now a lot of what we do with a wildfire lens on top of it, and with a lens of where are we seeing more load, more renewables, more electric vehicles, more distributed renewable resources, more storage being deployed, so that those circuits are able to take those increased technology demands when they come. So that's the other big planning lens that we bring to what we're doing.
Any thoughts, Nancy, Danielle, to add to this point?
Well, I guess I'd say, as Danielle alluded to, you've got 2 sets of infrastructure in the LA area. You got LADWP, which is separate from Southern California Edison system, but it'll be very important to both systems to connect to diverse and low-cost resources outside the basin. And to do that, again, we need to plan and build more transmission as quickly as possible. I just wanted to explain briefly why we do need both wind and solar resources in roughly equal amounts on the grid. And that's because when you have both resources, you're producing energy around the clock, and so you need less storage to fill in the gaps. If you're over-reliant on solar, you need a lot more storage to shift all that power to times when the sun isn't shining. And that not only costs a lot more, but those batteries require a lot of extra materials, metals and minerals that have to be mined and disposed of. Now, we've talked a lot about infrastructure, and admittedly, it is tough to build transmission lines because nobody wants them in their backyards, nobody wants them in their view. But for the LA area, there's a really interesting proposal that's been made that folks should know about, to build an undersea transmission cable that would start near San Luis Obispo, where the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant is being retired, and it would connect to the transmission system at several gas-fired power plants along the Southern California coast. And that will allow some of those gas plants to shut down by delivering the renewable energy into LA, which is transmission constrained, which is what is needed if we're going to ever retire those plants. And much of that energy could come from offshore wind at the Central Coast, where that subsea cable would start. So that's a really interesting option. It also has the benefit of plugging into that same infrastructure now being used to distribute power from the gas-fired power plants to consumers, but we could plug in there and distribute wind and solar power instead. And the line would also be immune to wildfires, which reduces that risk. So to us, that proposal makes a lot of sense to us, and seems to make sense to folks and people in LA.
Thank you.
And I'll just add.
Right.
Sorry, Rosa. I think everything that Drew explained is excellent. It's really important to be thinking about both modernizing and upgrading and hardening our infrastructure at the same time. As we transition to more renewables, those renewables are very location dependent. So you have to get wind energy where the wind is blowing. And so that will require sort of a shift in terms of how we plan and how we build new transmission lines. But absolutely having those lines be, safe and modern is critical to making sure that we're able to get power to customers effectively and safely.
Yeah. I want to come back to this because, this is all really heading to what should we look like in LA. But before we get to that question, what I'd like to do is have Stephen discuss, his research a little bit more about his research on the future of the grid and some of these concepts that we've begun to hear about around distributed energy resources and microgrids. Stephen, could you first explain what they are, and then if you can share how you're working with utilities to look into the integration of the DERs and microgrids to make the grid more sustainable and efficient?
Sure. Just remember to unmute. So DER, distributed energy resources, broadly defined, includes both devices that can generate, but also devices that can consume electricity. So for example, diesel generators are distributed energy resources, but perhaps more importantly, going forward, PV panels on the rooftops, even small wind turbines that people have developed that can put on the building, for example. But they also include electric vehicles, smart buildings, smart appliances, and smart power electronics. So going forward in the future, many of those distributed energy resources will be able to not only generate, but some may be able to measure, compute, communicate, and actuate. So they have intelligence and they are connected. So the grid is going to evolve over decades into probably the world's largest and most complex Internet of Things. So this is really an important resource we are going to need to really achieve the goal of 100% clean and renewable electricity. Microgrid is basically a local network of such distributed energy resources that can self-sustain, hopefully self-sustain at the least. So now microgrids will be connected to the macrogrid, and for reliability, for example, going forward, they should have more and more ability to really operate in a standalone mode. And that is going to be important because they can generate what the community needs, but they can also adapt the flexible loads within the microgrid to fluctuating supplies. So what are they important? If you look at the grid for the last 100 years, there are few large bulk generators. These are fossil fuel generators. In the US, there are about 10 to 20,000 fossil fuel generators. And this is where we control. And then we have hundreds of millions of passive loads that we don't really actively control. So now we have a huge network and we only control very, very small, tiny fraction of those nodes, and the rest of them are just passive loads. When we have a large network of passive loads, that's easy to manage. Going forward, if we're going to replace all those bulk generators by, say, wind and solar and other clean resources, then we lose that. We cannot control where, how much, and when to generate. Yet we have all these distributed energy resources that will allow us to really have much finer control to improve the reliability and also the security of the network. So one example people like to use, I guess since we are in Southern California, is that we build fighter jets to be unstable. And then we wrap around active control to stabilize it. so that we get much higher performance than before. So that's one thing we need to do. As Drew said, we need to put a lot more technology into today's grid in order to really achieve our goal.
Yeah, I might just add, Stephen, because I think you're so right to focus on it. You know, just as an example of where we are today, we have some of this, but not a lot of this capability. Last summer in the outages that we had, we were able to call on, once the first outages came up and we had to figure out how to deal with the potential for more, we were able to call on about 250 of our residential customers and over 10,000 of our business customers to actually reduce their demand. So demand response, which is a very rudimentary form of using DERs in the way you're talking about it. But it does make a difference if you can control them and have them reduce their load at the time when the peak is happening and yet we don't have enough supply. That's how we actually were able to avoid having more of those rolling outages on following weekends. We actually had about 1,200 megawatts of that demand reduction show up once we went out and asked people to do it. What we want to do is we want to do it through technology so it's much more automated and almost instantaneous, to your point. That's where the grid needs to evolve to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really interesting in that August 14 is where this rolling blackout becomes most severe. And California, well, in a CPUC jurisdiction, we only asked to reduce the loads by 1 gigawatt. And then by August 17th, 3 days later, after all this messaging, the California have reduced the load by 4 gigawatt, 4 times what's needed. And that avoids the remaining rolling outages. So there's a huge opportunity.
Any other thoughts on this?
The only other thing I'll mention is I think Stephen, you mentioned it, but EVs are going to play a really interesting role in it. They are both their source of demand because they charge and they draw power from the grid. They potentially could give power back at some point, some kinds of EVs. But even just managing when they charge and the rate they charge can make a huge difference. And the interesting thing is it's the first time in our history of our grid that we will have mobile load on the system that actually shows up in different places at different times. And having to figure out how to model that and how to control it and manage it is something that we're just all at the beginning of. But that's a great sort of thing to think about, especially for folks like you, Stephen, as you're trying to figure out how do we actually begin to model and plan for those things. So I think that's just another fact I'd throw out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I respond?
Yes, please, because I know that you've done a lot of work on stability and control of the EV, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the key to turning EV from a burden into the grid, because it's a huge load, into part of the solution is really smart workplace charging. If we look at so I looked at the CalISO duck curve last week, and if we do workplace charging and feel the value of that duck curve, we can charge 13 million EVs. Now our goal is to have 5 million EVs by 2030. So that's one. Secondly, if we look at August 2020 rolling outages, on August 14, we asked the load to reduce by 1 gigawatt for between, let's say, 15 to 2.5 hours. That's the average 2 hours. That's only 2 gigawatt hour. How many EVs does that correspond to? If we assume future EVs all have 300-mile range, and if we assume every EV can just contribute 20% of their battery capacity at time of emergency, then we only need 100,000 EVs to have avoided the rolling blackouts of last August. Now, California probably has more than 800 EVs today, and we're going to have 5 million EVs by 2030, hopefully. And therefore, there's tremendous opportunity to really have use EV as a resource for grid stability. And as you said, there are a lot more interesting technologies, these mobile storage and demands and so on. But even today, even when we cannot do this vehicle to grid, if we just do smart charging alone, we can save between 50 to 75% in infrastructure costs and 33% in operating costs.
Danielle, I know that your organization is doing a lot around storage as well. And so are there any other thoughts around this topic?
No, I can't compete with Professor Lowe and his knowledge of these types of things. It's all very exciting to think through what this future very flexible and multifaceted grid is going to look like.
Perfect. I know that we are running out of time. Jessica, do we have time for another question, or would you like to go to the audience?
If we can go to the audience, because we have a lot of questions coming in. So.
Perfect. Why don't we do that?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So Nancy, I think I'll throw this first question to you. Where other parts of the nation have a war on coal, here in California, we have a war on natural gas. Some municipalities are now banning the installation of gas appliances in newly constructed homes and buildings. Why can't activists accept that natural gas and renewables combine to be a good, reliable mix of energy sources, rather than making natural gas a pejorative term?
Okay, that's a big one. I think a lot of the studies have shown that, in fact, if we retain some of our gas-fired capacity, it will go a long ways towards achieving our goals. You know, using those plants a small amount of the time, you know, that it makes a lot of sense to keep some of them around to make sure we can address reliability issues in a relatively low-cost way. We certainly don't have a war going against natural gas, but I would say we do have to reduce it considerably to meet our goals, and to do that, you know, we do need a diverse mix of renewable energy.
Thank you. Dr. Lowe, I'll direct this one to you. How important is development of superconducting materials in electricity transmission? Do we need a moonshot approach to bringing these materials to market?
I think that would be nice, but I think certainly we need all kinds of investments to develop all kinds of technologies, and that will be one of them, but it won't be enough. So for example, the loss in transmission network and distribution network is less than 10%. In transmission network, maybe 2 or 3%, and therefore that's certainly something that we should save, but we need a lot more than that. And I think one of the things that we have to really remember is that so much of the modern life today depends on technology that was developed 60 years ago, 30 years ago. So we need to develop the fundamental sciences so that we will have what we need when we need it. And storage is one big thing. If there's going to be inexpensive large-scale storage, that would change the game. Now, battery has been a very mature technology. The basic fundamental chemical processes have not changed much. Yet, this, say, lithium-ion is one major technology in storage. But we need to also develop new kinds of storage devices and technologies. So some of my colleagues at Caltech are using nanotechnology to really think about a different way to do energy storage. And those kind of fundamental technology, even though they may be ahead of their time in terms of commercialization, are really critical.
Thank you so much. Drew, I'll direct this one to you. How are connections with neighboring states' grids being factored into planning for increasing resilience of California's grid?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so we already have, do take a lot of that into account, and the organization that's most responsible for that is the California ISO, so the Independent System Operator. They're charged with making sure that, you know, there is enough supply and transmission capability available to actually meet the projected demands of the system on a daily basis. We obviously work closely with them and other organizations in the states to try to help inform that view. But just a couple of examples. So, you know, the state is interconnected with the state of Nevada, Arizona, and we do bring in a lot of energy and both renewables and other kinds of energy from those places. A number of the renewable energy projects that have been built that are actually counted for California projects are directly connected by transmission lines to California, but they're in Nevada, for instance, some of the solar plants particularly. But we also import from other states areas where they're not directly connected. They have to be transmitted across their transmission lines. So that planning is done regularly. It's planned for daily, and the planning goes out many years in terms of what that's going to look like. There's also a market for excess energy, the energy imbalance market it's called, that we participate in to make sure that we have access to additional energy as we need it on a trading basis, going day to day in more of a real-time basis as well. So that's all there in place. I think we need to do more of that. One of the things that we saw this last summer, we talked about the 2020 outages, was not only was the weather event was actually wider than just California, which is a little unusual, but I think it's part of climate change. It was a multi-state heat storm that impacted other states as well. So they were having their own capacity demand, shortage issues to deal with. So there was less available potentially to come into California. We're also starting to see other states ramp up their requirements for renewable energy. And so we can't necessarily count going forward on renewable energy that might be excess in their systems coming to us without us having to sort of have it more dedicated. So all of those are things that are going into the sort of updated view on how we plan for the system. We definitely take that into account now and have to continue in the future.
Thank you. Danielle, I'll direct this one to you. How do you feel about the French handling of clean nuclear power and believe burying in container safely in the ground?
That is another very loaded question. I actually have spent some time working on nuclear power in California, and California is very different from where France is right now. We only have one active nuclear power plant that's still generating. That's set to retire in 2024 and 2025, but we do have nuclear waste that is being stored at our nuclear generating facilities. It's a very challenging topic that requires a lot of coordination among Western states and with the federal government about where and how to store that. And there have been some pretty challenging roadblocks to that discussion. So I don't have any ACP position to share on that issue. I think that the prospect of, refining nuclear waste and repurposing it for future generation or for secondary generation is probably not something that's at the forefront of California's mind right now, just because we have a suite of other technologies that can be deployed and that we are learning how to use very effectively. And there are some pretty significant barriers to future nuclear generation in the state. So I'll leave it there. Good question.
Thank you. Nancy, welcome back. This question's for you. Why did LA County prohibit wind development?
Nancy, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. All right. So, the area is considered environmentally sensitive, and I think what is not taken into account is the fact that wind energy has a very small footprint and can actually be very compatible even with sensitive habitats. And the challenge before us is just so great that we have to we're going to have to be a little more flexible about where we allow renewable energy resources to be sited, because we're just not going to meet our goals you have to go where the wind resource is, right? There's only good wind resources in certain very particular areas, and we have climate change is an imperative to address, and we just have to, I think, be a little more open-minded about the actual impacts of wind energy, which are pretty minimal. And you can go hiking, you can continue all the environmental activities in the area with wind turbines.
Okay. And just as a follow-up to that, this questioner asks, the Ivanpah solar panel on the California-Nevada border is an example of a renewable energy boondoggle. It encompasses 4 square miles of desert land to generate less than 500 megawatts of power. Its impact on nature are well documented. How can such similar projects be justified in the future?
I can take that. I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from California's early leadership in renewable energy. It certainly hasn't been perfect, and there's room for improvement, and we're going to have to move forward with that. But As far as I know, there's quite a bit of research that's happening at that particular solar facility. There's been a lot of work underway between both the wind and solar industries with environmental groups about environmental data collection and research and ways to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impact to not only species, but to land use as well. And so we're taking those lessons very seriously and applying them as we move forward. But there's also a very significant environmental impact of not acting and not building renewables, and that's the climate crisis that we face.
Thank you so much, Danielle. All right, there's so many questions coming and I'm trying to keep track. Would burial of transmission lines increase grid efficiency? I don't know if Drew or Stephen, if you guys want to jump in here.
I'm not sure it necessarily increases efficiency. Again, I'm not sort of engineer expert on that, so, but you're still going to have line losses even if you bury them. You may be able to contain some of that, but the one thing I think everybody knows is that the costs of doing that are significantly higher than the costs of sort of traditional transmission lines, which are basically on poles above ground. It doesn't mean it isn't a tool we should all be looking at using in the right places. I think we should, but it's primarily a cost issue because of the complexity of burying them and the additional technology needed to deal with the heat and from the conductors underground and all of that. Stephen, I don't know if you have a different view, but you're on mute.
I agree completely with what you said. I don't really have anything to add, except that the cost is much higher, not only in terms of capital costs, but also maintenance.
Thank you. And this is a question for Stephen. Do you see diamond nuclear voltaic batteries coming into picture available to mass markets before 2030? If not, when? Are there other technologies on the horizon that are more promising than DNVs in this field?
So I don't know, maybe Nancy or Danielle can take this better than I can. Yeah, I don't have any particular insight. I think we need all kinds of such technologies, as Danielle said at the beginning, that we are sort of behind in terms of the schedule. So we need to really have explore and really try to develop and deploy all kinds of technologies. I don't have a particular insight on this one.
Nor do I.
Very smart question. Hopefully we'll get back to you on that one. For Drew and Danielle, as California becomes more dependent on solar and wind energy, how are we going to build enough battery storage capacity fast enough to keep the power on during periods of extreme heat?
So I think it's there's multiple steps we need to take, and we've talked about both. One is obviously absolutely building storage and increasing the storage that the pace at which we're putting storage out there. And that's one of the things that came out of the review that the joint agencies did of last summer's event, was to look at more resource adequacy, resources, meaning connected near the load centers, and a lot of that is going to be storage. I think we're going to have over 1,000 megawatts in our service territory of storage on by this coming summer, we hope, if we all goes according to plans. And we had only a couple hundred, we had several hundred on last summer. So in statewide, it's going to be thousands of megawatts of storage, which is great to see. That will help. We also need to do a lot more around what Stephen and we were talking about, which is also realizing that we can use demand response. We can use the demand side as also a resource more effectively and plan for that in a more coordinated way. So I think you need both pieces there.
Yeah, I agree. I think the state is doing a lot already to bring new storage online very quickly. More diversity in the types of storage is going to be helpful in terms of longer duration storage and making sure that there's good co-location with wind and solar resources. I will also kind of call back to the question about regional coordination and some of the discussion that we've had about transmission as well. The more diversity that we have in the generation portfolio, the more easy it will be for us to kind of right size the amount of storage that we need to go with that. So you really need to be thinking through all of those pieces together to get the optimal mix of renewables, storage, transmission, distributed resources, et cetera.
Thank you. Drew, this will go back to you. Given that the general trend is toward microgrids and decentralized grids, where do you see Edison in the future, especially if households can generate all their energy via renewables and energy storage?
So I guess I might have a different view on the premise of the question than whoever asked it. I do think that there is a growing role for DERs, and some will be in micro or microgrids or similar configurations. I think as we look at the feasibility and the cost of people fully disconnecting from the grid, other than in times of outage, emergency, or where there's a compelling reason to do it for a short period of time, I don't think we don't see it as that being where we're going to go. That's sort of the natural evolution of most of the grid. I think we will continue to see a need for a strong central grid that has this kind of flexibility we've been talking about to connect people's resources in their homes or businesses behind the meter, their solar, their storage, that they can take advantage of when they want to and need to, but they're still going to be connected to the grid as for a form of either backup or supplementing the power and the need when they have greater demands or when their resources aren't producing it. So I think I see a greater set of interdependencies forming, but I think the need for a strong centrally managed planned grid is still there. All of the discussion we've had today about planning and needing to make sure we see it as an entire system, I think is really how we're reviewing it. And that's the work we're doing with this reimagining the grid effort that we have going on right now, is how to see it as a connected system and not focus just on one piece evolving, just the microgrids or just the central grid, but both.
Thank you.
Just one sentence. Just from the control perspective, I think we need to really coordinate this large network of distributed energy resources. So we do need a platform to have to sort of orchestrate the entire system so that you can work and you can work efficiently. And I think that platform, what that is certainly evolving. And utility companies, I think, can play an extremely important role to provide that kind of platform.
Thank you. This one's for Nancy. What's the single most important step that should be taken to harden the grid against cyber attack?
Oh, that's not for me. How about Stephen?
All right, back to Stephen.
Okay, so absolute security is extremely important, as both cyber security but also physical security. And there are a lot of research in the research community looking at these type of issues. But I think in practice, I think Drew probably has more insight because it's such an important component for the utilities. We cannot have a secure grid, then it will be a major roadblock to achieving 100% clean and renewable electricity.
Yeah, I completely agree. When we look at what the work streams are to get to this sort of modern grid we're all going to need, cybersecurity is its own work stream and own focus area. And we're learning every day. It's like any other network that we're all interacting with and building, financial networks and other things, has to be part of the backbone. The platform has to be cyber secure. Multi-layered cybersecurity is what you need to stay ahead of where the bad actors are going, frankly.
Awesome. Well, thank you, all of you. I'm so sorry we ran out of time, but we have so many more questions, so we'll have to have you all back. Rosa, I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank all of our panelists for spending time with us today, and to our global audience who is here. We have over 600 people, I believe, on this discussion today, so thank you very much. Let me send this back to Kim.
What a terrific discussion. I just want to thank you all for your time and your expertise. I know how busy you are, but sharing this with our audiences in Southern California and across the nation has been such a benefit and is so appreciated. And as Jessica said, we have to have you back. We need more time with you. So thank you so very much.